Hey Jude, don't make it bad. Take a sad song and make it better.
Welcome to Tomorrow Never Knows with me, Bob Wilson, and Sir Warren Brown, the Lord Mayor of Art, just back from sailing the Pepperland Sea. Today we welcome authors Paul Ferrante and Patricia Stenman. They'll dish all about Paul's 30 Minutes in Memphis, a Beatles story, and Patricia's Diary of a Beatlemaniac. And if we're really lucky, I mean really, really lucky, Henry the Horse will dance the waltz. Welcome, everyone.
Well, good evening, Paul, and of course, good evening, Bob and Warren. Hello. I was going to say that, Paul, your book is amazing. I enjoyed it so much, and it's fab. And I had some questions for you to start with. Maybe this is a two-pronged question. I wanted to ask you first, if you can tell us why you chose to write a Beatle-themed Beatles book, a fiction book at this point, and also what gave you the inspiration, as well as another part of this question is what is the difficulty in writing Beatles fiction? It's a true story. So try to answer all those at once.
All right, Patty. And so we'll start at the beginning. I mean, I was in the second grade when the Beatles first came to America. I remember seeing them. I had two memories that come to me, my earliest memories. The first one was the JFK assassination. I was in school at the time. I was going to a Catholic school. And the second memory I have is the Ed Sullivan Show. So I kind of got in on the ground floor, although, you were a few years ahead of me. I like to think of you as the slightly older Italian sister that I never had.
Yeah, right.
But I remember the Ed Sullivan Show, and then from then it was game on. I ended up getting all the albums along the way, knowing every song, reading a lot of books about them as well. Because in addition to loving the music and having it be a big part of my life, I've always been a history nut. So I really, starting with the Hunter Davis book, I've been reading Beatles books forever. And of course, watched the anthology back in the 90s and just finished watching Get Back, which was wonderful. So I've really been with the Beatles all that time. And when I started writing professionally, my books anyway, in 2012, I always managed to sneak a little bit of Beatles stuff in there. I have a young adult series called the T.J. Jackson Mysteries. And I specifically wrote a character, one of the three main characters. His name is Bortnicker. And he's kind of a nerdy kind of guy, but he's cool in his own way. And one of the things about this guy is that he is a Beatles savant. So he knows all the songs, he knows all the trivia. He does a very lame impersonation of John Lennon for his friends to entertain them. And so the Beatles were making their way into my books for years. But then I decided that I was going to write a straight up Beatles fiction book. In 2016, I started work on it. I was having my hip replaced, actually. And so that gave me an opportunity to write the book because I was going to be home from school. I was still teaching at the time. So what I did was I researched for about 2 months leading up to when I was going to start writing the book. And that's the thing about writing Beatles fiction. There isn't a lot of it out there. And some of it that's out there gets pretty highly criticized. So what I really wanted to do, because I love historical fiction, I wanted to write a historical fiction story, not a fan fiction. I didn't want this to be kind of fantasy stuff. I said, what I'm going to do is I am going to write a story about a girl who's an ultimate Beatles fan living in Memphis, Tennessee in the 60s, who gets to experience this whole thing. And what I did was I set it against the backdrop of the 1966 kind of ill-fated tour, because that has always been a very, very intriguing subject to me. Going to a Catholic school, as you did, Patty, because we've become very good friends since then. When the Beatles first hit, I mean, the nuns in my school, most of whom were Irish, by the way, they were just all over the Beatles. They couldn't stand it. They were, they thought that they was, long hair, dirty subversives type stuff like that. And I remember days after they were on the Ed Sullivan Show, we suddenly had a directive that came down from our principal about hair not being allowed to go past the collar or over the ears. But this was like something they couldn't stop. I mean, it was a tsunami. But in 1966, when John Lennon made those famous, remarks about the Beatles being more popular than Jesus, this was an opportunity for my teachers, especially at the time, Sister Teresa Marie, who was as Irish as they came, to say, you see, that heathen Lennon, we told you, but it always stuck in my mind. And so I paid attention to what I was seeing in the news about the backlash, especially in the South, and the Beatle burnings and all that other stuff. If you put that piece of history together with what for me is my Beatles sweet spot, which is 1965, 1966. I mean, Help into Rubber Soul into Revolver. I said, I'm going to write a story that takes place in 1966 during this whole backlash type of thing. And I was so happy with the way it worked out. But I got to tell you, I researched the heck out of it, because I know, because I'm on a lot of Beatle Facebook pages, you get something wrong with these people and you're going to hear about it and they're going to call you on it. And I don't consider myself a Beatles scholar. I'm a guy who's written 10 books and one of them happens to be about the Beatles, but I sure didn't want to get it wrong. So that was actually the most fun, reading books, that I had not read yet. I read the Bob Spitz book, which I liked. And I read Beatles 66 by Steve Turner, which zeroed in on that 1 year. And then I just went through all kinds of, newspaper archives, looked up all these articles that were written at the time in different cities where they were on tour. Then I went on YouTube. YouTube was a great wealth of information for me. All these videos from during those years. I watched the Ron Howard documentary. I went back through the anthology again, and I put it all together, and this is what came out of it.
And I wanted to say that, we're talking about Beatle fiction, but what's so unique about your book, as I just love it, is that you have one chapter with Beatle history from that year, and then it goes into the chapter of fiction with your heroine and the heroes and things, and then it goes back again, 2 chapters down, you're talking history again. So you're getting a really good, solid foundation in Beatle history from that year too, which is really interesting. And I like that about your book a lot.
Well, it was written for teens and up. And what I wanted to do, being a teacher, of course, is I wanted to teach as to entertain. So what I did was I juxtaposed the story of the 66 tour, stop by stop on the tour, with what was happening to my protagonist, Marnie Culpepper. And what happens is the Beatles tour and Marnie cross paths in Memphis on August 19th, 1966.
And that was just perfect, by the way you did that.
Thank you.
I also, I wanted to ask you if you could talk a little bit about the plot. And I was really fascinated because I was about the same age as she was. And we talked about this a few times, that how did you actually get into the mind of a 15-year-old teenage girl?
Not easy. Believe me, not easy. But here's the thing. Marnie, just to give you a quick, or listeners and viewers, a quick overview. Marnie's a 15-year-old girl growing up in Memphis, Tennessee in 1966. And she comes from a broken family. Her mother actually walks out on her and her father the weekend of JFK's funeral. And this is due in part because her father, who is a sergeant in the Memphis Police Department, a former sergeant in the Army, has PTSD from Korea. And he's got these tremendous mood swings and stuff, and he could be very hard to deal with. So the mother walks out, leaving her and her father, and they have an African-American housekeeper named Tilly, who's a great character, who, she doesn't really like the Beatles either. Her father just lets her go with it because this becomes Marnie's life. This is really what keeps her afloat. She's got their pictures plastered all over her walls. She had her friend Miles hook up this kind of rig. It's like a Rube Goldberg type thing in her room where she can reach out in the morning and just press a button and an LP will fall on the turntable and start playing. It's that kind of a thing. The Beatles are her whole life, and because she needs something. And so when Miles comes to her one day, and by the way, Miles just happens to be the only Jewish kid in the whole school. So she and Miles are kind of considered the somewhat oddballs in their class. So they kind of band together. So when Miles comes to her one day and presents her with 2 tickets to the Mid-South Coliseum second show, the evening show on August 19th, 1966, she's absolutely thrilled. It's her greatest desire. She's finally going to see the Beatles. But then about a week or two later, John makes those comments, or those comments become public in the United States. And beginning with the DJs in Birmingham, the boycotts begin, the Beatle burnings begin, and she becomes kind of a pariah. Her friends who are more conformist turn their backs on the Beatles and want her to do so too. She refuses. She also becomes kind of an outcast in her own Baptist congregation. And so it's really a tough thing for her. And then on top of everything else, she finds out, and this is pretty well documented, that there were various death threats made against them if they were to come to Memphis. In fact, you can go on YouTube and see an interview with a KKK member in the parking lot of the Mid-South Coliseum, where he's more or less threatening that something is going to go down during the concert. So anyway, Marnie gets wind of it. And the problem is she can't really share this with her father because her father is so upset with her her behavior that he forbids her to go to the concert that night. So she's got to figure a way to sneak out to get to the concert to save the Beatles. And the way she looked at it was, well, they saved me, and now it's my turn to save them. And how did I get into the mind of a 15-year-old girl? Well, from teaching middle and high school for 40 years, I dealt with a lot of teenage girls, so many teenage girls. And I saw all the problems. I heard all the stories. I saw the drama. I saw the angst. Oh my goodness. But of course, I had my own daughter, who I think you're familiar with, my daughter, Caroline. Caroline, she was born in 91. from the moment she was born, she was a Beatles fan. Some of our fondest memories together are watching Help. That was our movie, not Hard Day's Night. Help, over and over and over. She knows all the lines. She, go through the window, all that kind of stuff. And so I gave the book to her and I said, listen, you're a female. Is this somewhat accurate to the way a girl that age would feel for some of these different situations? And so really she was my toughest critic. And it got by her and she said, yeah, no, it all makes sense. That's how I would have felt, et cetera, et cetera. I just want to throw in that at her wedding reception, which was a few weeks ago, we just squeezed it in before this wave of COVID hit up here. She and I, and this was her choice, danced our dance together to In My Life. Which was the same song that my mother and I danced to at my wedding in 1986.
Oh, wow.
So
Think
that's
about
how
that.
I did it.
Very nice.
Fantastic. That's fantastic. I wanted to ask you a question also about, you base the story, of course, on the concert in Memphis, the second concert, and that was on August 1966. And during that concert, what happened was there was a cherry bomb that went off on the stage. And the Beatles had thought it was actually a shot that was fired at them, and they were wondering which one of them got shot. That played into your theme of the book as well, hasn't it?
Yeah. And I don't want to give away the whole plot because boy,
No.
I'll buy this book. But during that evening, somebody did throw a cherry bomb up on the stage, and they were about a minute and change into George's song, If I Needed Someone. As a matter of fact, you can hear the recording. It's on YouTube, and you can hear the pop. You could
Wow.
hear the pop when that was off. And the other three of them immediately looked at John because they thought it was he who had been shot, and he just kind of gave them a wink, and they kept going, and they didn't really miss a beat, which is really incredible and shows what professionals they really were.
That's true. That's true. Also, getting back to your main character, Marnie, I know you must feel this way. You think she really personifies the way she acted and what she did. This first generation of Beatlemaniac girls, which includes me.
Right. Well, yeah, because, I saw how the girls reacted in my elementary school when the Beatles first, all the guys were kind of like looking at the Beatles and saying, so this is what they like. Okay. But you know what the big test was, Patty, was sending the book to you and having you read it. And I'm saying to now I wrote the book before I even knew about you, your book, whatever. Myself, man, I hope she thinks it's realistic. And of course we did a book exchange. You sent me your book. So I read your book and I said, this is like Marnie. I mean, she's Marnie. So you were having the same kind of reaction, and you kind of did, which is neat. Yeah. When I read it, and I read your book, and then I think she is a lot like me. And then I thought, now how did this guy get into the brain of a 15-year-old, original Beatlemaniac? And I felt that you did a really good, a great job on what we liked, what we didn't like, how we felt. You got into our brains. And that was good. That was excellent. So I thank you. I had to do so much, you don't think about this stuff, but, like she watches TV at night with her father. So what I had to go through the nightly TV schedule. There are only really 3 major networks then. Right. Nightly TV schedule. What would she be watching? What would her father be watching? Well, her father is watching Combat, and he's watching Bonanza and stuff. Yes. And she wants to watch The Girl from U.N.C.L.E. And she's she's one of the first girls in her group to let her hair grow long and straight rather than the beehive bouffants that were, so
Popular.
prevalent in southern teenagers back then. So I had to research so much just pop culture outside of the Beatles because I had
Sure.
some of that stuff and I was like, okay. And then what were the other hits from 1966? I went through the top 10 lists from week to week while the Beatles were going along with their tour. There was just so much to get into. What would she be reading? Well, she'd be reading Tiger Beat and and stuff like that, and
Yeah.
out the pictures from these magazines to put on her wall. So there was just a lot of neat stuff that I had forgotten about that all came back to me when I was doing the research to kind of flesh out this really remarkable girl.
Yeah, and she was really remarkable, and it was just perfect. I mean, I told you about that before. I just thought you hit the nail on the head, really. So, good job, great job. And one thing I wanted to ask you too, as I remember hearing from you something about, John Lennon's sister, Julia, and.
Right.
She did help you choose your title somehow for the book. Can you tell us that great story?
Oh gosh, this is a weird story, but it's true. Okay. What happened was I wrote the book and I said, this is going to be my one and only Beatles story. And I know there's a lot of Beatles stuff out there. So I want mine to just have a wow factor. I want it to, get attention. How can I do that? So I'm thinking, now my sister Carol Young, who's a wonderful artist, she's done a couple of covers for me because I've done a couple of books independently, not with my publisher, as I did this book. And I went to her and I gave her my concept. And originally, because of just based on what was going on in the story with the death threats and the this and the that, my original concept, and don't laugh now, was the Beatles must die, okay? And so you had this cover with the little crosshairs and kind of a silhouette. It looks kind of like John. My sister did all the artwork. I said, all right, that's pretty gripping. I said, cool. I mean, So I had 10 advanced copies printed. And somehow I gave a couple, of course, I gave one to my sister, my family, but I said, let me see if I can get a couple of opinions about the story. So somehow I got my hands on the address for Julia Baird, John's half sister. And I sent it to her at her office in Liverpool because she was, she's actually a former special ed teacher. So we had something kind of in common. And she was at that time running Beatle tours in Liverpool. I don't know if it's the Cavern City tours, but she had her own company. So I send her this book and I never hear back from her. And I was like, okay, so you sent it. She's well known, she's busy, whatever. Then what happened was, and I'll never forget because it was Veterans Day 2017. I had to go to school because my school district deemed it not important enough to have Veterans Day off. So I got in the car, took off for work. My wife had the day off, so she's home. So around 7 o'clock in the morning, the phone rings. And of course, my wife is ticked off. She's got a vacation day and some clown is calling at 7 o'clock in the morning. She thinks it's me because I forgot my lunch again, right? So she gets on the phone and she's like, oh, and the voice on the other end says, hello, is Paul there? And my wife's like, no, who's this? She goes, oh, it's Julia Baird, John Lennon's sister. So that woke my wife up. And she's like, and she goes, oh, no, he went off to work and he's working today. And they ended up having about a 20-minute chat, which was my wife said was totally delightful. So Julia says to her, well, tell Paul I'm going to call him back later this week and we'll have a chat. Okay. So she calls me up at work. She goes, you're not going to believe who called. And I was like, who? And she said, John Lennon's sister, and I'm like, oh no. I was like, oh, what did she say? And she's kind of filling me in, but she's going to call again. And I was like, yeah, right. So like 3 days later, we're eating dinner. My wife cooks up this nice, you would have liked it, Patty, chicken parm, right?
Oh, wow.
Cooks up a nice chicken parm. I got a mouthful of food. Phone rings. She goes over. She goes, it's her. It's John's sister. So I'm like, I'm spitting it all out. I get on the phone with her and we had the most wonderful conversation. She said, I loved your book. I read it in one sitting. She goes, I was intrigued. I sat down, I started reading it and I got so much into it. I told my assistant to go get me a pot of tea. I went in my office, I closed the door and I read the whole thing in one sitting. So I'm like, oh, yeah. And she said, I've got to tell you, historically, you were spot on with everything. She said, my brother and the boys were deathly afraid of what might happen in the South, especially in Memphis. They didn't know what was going to happen. It was a very trying time for all of them, et cetera, et cetera. So I was like, yes, I got that right. And then she started telling me about when they were younger and Paul would come over, this is before her mother died, John and Paul would come over and they'd be singing songs and she'd be sitting, she idolized her brother, loved her brother. Okay. Looked up to him. And so we had this wonderful, wonderful conversation. And she says, she goes, I'd like you to send me another copy when you get a chance. And I'll try to get one to Paul, I'll send one to his office. I don't know if it'll get through, but, and I'm like, yeah, great, super. She goes, and I'm going to send you a copy of my book too. And I'm like, yeah, which is behind me over here, which was great. And then just before we hang up, she says, but Paul, and I'm like, oh, yes. She goes, there are a lot of people in this world who are still mourning the death of my brother. And they might find the cover and the title, if you consider what happened, they might consider it a little off-putting. Beautifully understated, Julia, good job. And I would hate for them to miss out on reading your book because they might be put off by the other stuff. She goes, but you can do whatever you want. It's your choice, it's your book. I really enjoyed it. So I get off the phone with her and it killed me. So I'm tossing and turning all night. I wake up the next morning, I say to my wife, we're changing the cover, we're changing the title. So I emailed her. I said, Julia, I really took what you said to heart and I'm going to change the cover and I'm going to change the title. I said, my sister can handle the cover, but I'm having a hard time with the title. So she emails me back, well, if you have ideas, run them by me and I'll tell you what I think. So genius here comes up with Tomorrow Never Knows. Why? Well, because it's one of the key songs in the whole book. Because, Revolver is the thing that really sets off Marnie and Miles. I said, how about, this is via email, how about Tomorrow Never Knows? And she emails back, I believe that's been taken. So I go online and I find like 3 of them and I'm like, oh no. So then I go back to her and I said, how about 30 Minutes in Memphis? It's alliterative. and they only used to play for about 30 minutes. What do you think? She gets back to me and she says, it sounds good, but I don't know if people will identify that as a Beatles story, just based on that. I was like, oh, okay. Then I go back to her again and I said, how about 30 minutes in Memphis, a Beatles story? She emails me back a one-word answer, Eureka. And that's how we got the title, and that's why she's acknowledged in the beginning of the book. And we ended up with 30 minutes in Memphis. Okay.
That's fantastic. Fantastic story.
That's my story. That's my story.
That's a great story.
Wonderful, sweet lady.
Great. Warren, did you have some questions you wanted to ask?
Yeah, I got one. You were just talking, your sister's the one that did the cover for your book. How did she come up with that? Do you know?
Well,
And did you play a part in that?
oh yeah. Whenever I've done 3 books independently, and she's done the cover for all of them. She's a wonderful artist. She does mostly, I don't know if you call it impressionist paintings. There's an artist named Edward Hopper. I don't know if you've ever seen his stuff. And she is kind of in that style. And she does very well for herself. She paints a lot of barns and rural scenes out on the east end of Long Island and stuff like that. But she's able to do just about anything because she was the head of a commercial art department for a big advertising agency, one at which my daughter happens to be the chief copywriter now. But I went to her with this idea. I said, listen, this is what was going on in the story. So I think I'd like to go red and black. I think that's very striking. And maybe kind of the first thing I was thinking of is the silhouette of the first Meet the Beatles album with the 4 heads. But then she said, that might be a bit much. She said, what if I can come up with a John-like figure for the cover? It won't be him exactly, but you'll look at it and you say, that kind of looks like John, because he was the key to this whole firestorm. So I said, yeah, okay. And then what we did was, she did, I said, then I want, the Beatles must die, and that kind of drippy, bloody thing, in the crosshairs. When she redid it, she just went with that. And it was really just, I thought, as powerful. So I really got to hand it to my sister. She helped me out on that end. And then, Julia helped me out a little with the title and went.
Well, that's a very unique cover. And that stands out to me. I'm a graphic artist, so that does stand out to me. Do you have any further plans for a sequel or another Beatle book?
Well, I guess in musical terms, you'd call me a one-hit wonder. I can't really think of another Beatles book to write. However, what I've managed to do is, as I said earlier, I have this young adult series of books called the T.J. Jackson Mysteries. And there's this one character, I mentioned him, his name is Bortnicker, he's the Beatles savant. And so what I did in this series, in book 2, the kids, there are 3 kids, TJ, who's the protagonist, they have a ghost hunting cable TV series, okay? So TJ, who by the way is always described as resembling a young Paul McCartney, so another Beatle reference. He's the cute one. Then you have Bortnicker, who's kind of like the nerdy guy. And then you have TJ's adopted cousin, Luann, who kind of keeps the boys in line. There's the 3 of them, they're the recurring characters. So in book 2, they're in Bermuda. And they're trying to investigate this mansion, which was the house of a Bermudian pirate turned planter. So they're doing this because the house is haunted. The Bermuda Trust wants them to come in and do an investigation. So anyway, they meet this guy named Chappie, who is going to be their driver for the week because they're all underage. I mean, they're barely out of middle school. They're in high school. And so they find out from Chappie that he became friendly with John. I stretched history a little bit here. He became friendly with John when John traveled to Bermuda in the year or so before his death. You know, there's the famous story about him, sailing the boat through the huge storm, et cetera, et cetera. But he got to Bermuda and he loved it. And so what I had happen was I had John become friendly with Chappie, who also has his own steel drum band that performs in Bermuda. So they're two musicians, they hit it off. So anyway, Chappie finds out that Bortnicker is a Beatles fanatic. And so whenever he's driving the kids all over the island, and they go from one end of Bermuda to the other in the course of the book, he's always got, Beatles CDs and everything in there. And he says to Bortnicker that John basically sometimes talks to him through his dreams. And of course, these are ghost stories. So, the whole paranormal thing it's there to begin with.
Yeah.
So anyway, while they're doing their investigation, the final night in this captain's house, Captain Tarver, they're looking for something, they can't find it. And somebody or something starts whispering in Bortnicker's ear. And he doesn't know who it is, but it sure sounds like John Lennon. So later on, he kind of runs this by Chappie and he says, I felt like, this is crazy, but I felt like John was talking to me tonight. And Chappie says, oh yeah, well, I told him all about you. He talks to me all the time. So I established that in book 2. Then in the latest book, just came out, it's called Terror in the Tower, and they're doing an investigation in the Tower of London. What happens is they are commissioned by Her Majesty to look into some weird goings on in the tower. And that's the whole premise of the book. By this time, they're international cable TV stars. They're finishing up high school by this time. So before they start the investigation in the tower, they have been signed up to go for a Liverpool tour. And their driver, who just happens to be Chappie's cousin who lives in England, in London, takes them up to Liverpool and does a tour for them. So the kids go to all the Beatle haunts. They go to Paul's house, they go to John's house, they go to Strawberry Field, they go to Penny Lane, they go to the Beatles Museum. They're all over the place. And they end up going into the Cavern Club, well, the new Cavern Club. And what happens in the story, and I think I sent Patty the little section from that chapter.
Yeah.
Bortnicker goes to the restroom by himself, right? And so he goes in there and there's nobody in the restroom. And he does what he's got to do, and he's washing his hands, and he looks at the mirror, and over his shoulder, he sees a John Lennon lookalike leaning up against the wall.
Mm-hmm.
Leaning up against the wall, kind of like with his arms crossed. By the way, this is like shameless self-promotion here. And this John Lennon lookalike is wearing the straight pants with the Beatle boots, with a turtleneck, with the jacket. And so Bortnicker says something along the lines of, oh, you scared me. You look just like him. And he said, and he says something like, oh, well, I'm like that, and he says, are you appearing here this week? Because he thinks he's in a tribute band. He says, are you appearing here this week? And he goes, well, it appears that I am. And so he says, and then the John character says, so when's the last time I talked to you? Was it Bermuda? And then he knows it's John Lennon's ghost. And he says to John says to him, so how do I look? And he says, what do you mean? Well, what do I look like? And so he kind of describes it and he goes, oh, you're into the mop tops. You see, I'm going to appear to you the way you most think of me. And he's like, oh, yeah. So while they're talking, this other guy comes in the bathroom. He's wearing this like middle-aged guy's wearing a yellow submarine t-shirt. And he walks right between the two of them and doesn't acknowledge John's ghost though, because he can't see him. He goes in, he goes to the bathroom, he leaves, and they keep having this conversation. And Bortnicker tries to ask him about the afterlife. And, you know, he says to Bortnicker, well, do you have any questions for me? And he says, well, do you ever see George? And he said, you're trying to ask me about the afterlife. Can't help you there. He said, but he said, if I could be of any help while you're doing your investigation, you know, you let me know. He goes to Bortnicker, but what do you think you're going to get out of it? And Bortnicker says, oh, I don't know. Maybe she'll give us a medal or something. And he says, oh yeah, we got one of those. I said, back. And Bortnicker's like, oh, okay. And then he ends with him and he says, you know, I'm only here because of your friend TJ, because TJ is what they call a sensitive. So spirits are drawn to him. So Bortnicker says, so it's like he's like a TV antenna and he's got to be around for me to get reception from you. And he said, yeah, something like that. He said, but I want you to work with him and listen to him. And then he says, you know, he goes, I had a friend I was very close to. And we had a bit of a falling out. And I always kind of regretted it. And I want to make sure that that doesn't happen to you. And then he goes, but what do I know anyway? I'm just a rock and roll singer. That's all I ever was. That's all we ever were, you know, that kind of a thing. And so, and then he says, well, he goes, you know, cheerio, I'll see you. And he just, and that's my Big John scene. So the Beatles have shown up all over the place in a lot of my writing.
Very interesting stuff, Aaron. Sounds good. Sounds like a good read. So
it's fun.
Yes, I can imagine. I got two quick questions and then I'll hand it over to the Bulldog. You said you were a teacher of teenagers at that. Have any of your students read your books? You know, the 30 Minutes of Memphis, and what do they think of the Beatles?
Well, 30 Minutes came out towards the end of my career, and so I really didn't get a lot of feedback on 30 Minutes from them, which I kind of regret. But for years and years, and I taught 7th grade for about the last 10 years of my 40-year career. And I was an English teacher. We call it language arts. And I taught in Westport, which is one of the ritziest, toniest schools in Connecticut. In fact, there was a TV show that was on the last couple of years called American Housewife that was based or takes place in Westport, because it's just kind of like an alternate universe in some ways. But my kids loved the Beatles. And what I did was I would have a week and a half set aside every year that I would do a mini Beatles unit. And it took like 3 days. And of course I would have to do the same thing 4 times a day. But it never got old. And what I did was I went through the Beatles catalog and I tried to get about 10 songs that would cover it. And we would start with Love Me Do, because this was part of our poetry in it. So we would start with Love Me Do, which there is a video for. And I had a whole video thing put together by my daughter, because in addition to being a copywriter, she has her own film company. She's a screenwriter, director. I said, you got to put together for me a Beatles video collection that's going to follow this playlist. So we would start with Love Me Do. I would give the kids the lyrics to all the songs to show the progression in how complex the wording became, in addition to how the music became more interesting and complex. So we went from Love Me Do, then we would go to She Loves You, then we would go to the Ed Sullivan Show and I Want to Hold Your Hand. Then we would go to Yesterday. Then we would go to the Shea Stadium concert and I would show them a clip, the clip where Paul and John are singing Babies in Black. And what I did was I gave a commentary between songs to tell them the story of how these two soulmates met and the things that they had in common, even though they were pretty opposite types of guys, and how they started working together. And then George joined, and then Ringo joined, and then they went to Hamburg, and then they came back, and they were big fish in a small pond of Liverpool. They wanted to make it to London. They wanted to get the radio airplay. They wanted to get the records made. How this all happened, and then because a lot of it because of timing, and what happened with JFK, and I told them that story. I started telling my story in with everything else, how I was in the second grade the day he died, and I heard it over the loudspeaker, et cetera, et cetera. But then right after the funeral, it was just like, then was the Beatles. That's all we were hearing about was the Beatles. So the kids got more and more excited. And we would go the first day right up through Babies in Black, and I would freeze it when John and Paul were singing like nose to nose with the sweat pouring off them. And I'd say, just think about it. These two guys from a secondary city in England went from schoolyard chums who were going home after school and trying to write songs and teach each other how to play the guitar, etc., to the top of the entertainment world in just a few short years. And that's where we would stop part one. Then part two, we got into the transitional years, and we would, I would play Nowhere Man for them. I would show them a video of them on a TV show doing Help. And I would tell them about In My Life and how at that point I had danced with my mother. And while I was dancing with my mother that night in 1986, I don't think I mentioned this, we're dancing, and of course I'm just shuffling around. I didn't know what I was doing. And she says, remember when we watched the Ed Sullivan Show that night? That's how big that night was. That's how it stayed with her, and obviously stayed with me. So we would get all the way up through the transitional years, and we would end with Sgt. Pepper. And that just blew everybody's mind, because I had all the albums laid out along my blackboard in the front of the room, and you could just see how the look changed and changed and changed and changed. And then I played Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite, because that is what in English, in LA, what we call a found poem. Because we used to write a lot of poetry. I was the only teacher in the school who really did a lot of poetry. Now I'm proud of it. But a found poem is when you take words from other places that are not meant to be poetry, and you make a poem out of it, which is exactly what he did with that antique fair poster that he famously bought and brought home. So I would do Mr. Kite for them, and then I would show them a video of Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds from Yellow Submarine. I would show them that video, which is like psychedelic and everything like that. And then we started talking about, perhaps the drug influence and the 60s, and how the 60s were getting crazy and all that stuff. And then the last segment, we would do social protest. We talk about Blackbird. We would talk about Revolution, the song Revolution. and we would always end up with Let It Be which was from the movie, the video of them playing Let It Be. And I told them, and I said, guys, they were with me through my whole childhood. And I graduated because I was in a K-8 school. I graduated from the 8th grade, and that summer, the Beatles broke up. And that was just a piece of my childhood that was gone, you know? And they loved that unit so much. They used to have this website called Rate My Teacher, which is just not good. They've since changed it or gotten rid of it or whatever. But you know, every once in a while
you woke Bob up on that one.
Yeah. I wonder what the kids have been saying, you know? They would all talk about the Beatles unit, you know? When we would do I Am the Walrus. And I would play them the video from Magical Mystery Tour, where, I mean, that was just bizarre, you know, and the Eggmen, you know, jumping around, and they had all the lyrics there, and they're trying to get through the lyrics, and they would all walk out of my class that day, going down the hallway, singing I Am the Walrus, which was one of the coolest things you'd ever want to hear.
Yeah, that's cool. That's a nice history lesson using the Beatles. That's pretty cool. I wonder how many fans you made.
A lot.
Oh, that's good. All right. This question's for both of you, Patty and for you, Paul. Will we see you guys at the Beatles Fest in April?
You first, Patty.
Okay, well, if there's going to be a Beatle Fest in April, I will be there hopefully. And so will my second Beatle babe, Pat Mancusa. She has a new book, a second book. Marty, our third Beatle babe, she probably won't be coming out from Colorado. She's planning to meet us in Chicago in August at the next Beatle Fest. So I'm hoping, you know, if all goes ahead, if things get better, cross our fingers that we'll be there at the book area, and perhaps we'll be talking about fandom, Pat and I, and first generation fans. We're hoping, you know, if that goes well. So
yeah, well, on my end, really due in part to help from people like Patty and some of the people who I've been on their radio shows or podcasts, etc. I got up the nerve to contact Susan Ryan, who helps more or less put this event together. And I sent her a copy of the book, fingers crossed, because, you know, I am kind of a Beatles outsider, you know, in a way, you know, I'm not totally in the club here. And she read the book, she recommended it to Mark, is it Lapidus?
Lapidus, yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
She recommended it to Mark Lapidus, and then he ended up calling me, and we talked about the book and everything like that. And long story short, if there is an event in Jersey City in April, I'm invited as an author and hopefully as a panelist. And to me, that would be just like an absolute thrill. And so fingers crossed that the pandemic slows down by then. And I hope to be there and actually meet Patty for the first time.
There you go. Well, I'll just let you know, I'll be there too, and I hope to see both of you in person.
Oh, great. Yep.
And,
that'll be good.
If it's there in April anyway. Bulldog, are you awake down there?
We're awake, Uncle Warren. So Warren, how are you so far?
All right, well, I'm going to the bullpen for the Bulldog because he's growling over there. And I just woke him up, so he's even growling louder now.
Yeah.
All yours, Bob.
So Pat, when fans want to check out your book, where can they go and follow you on social media, and where can they order a copy of your cool book?
Okay. Thank you. Here's my book. It was published 3 years ago now, Diary of a Beatlemaniac. You could go onto my website, which is Diary of a Beatlemaniac, all one word, .com. And if you wanted an autographed copy, you could contact me that way. You could also go through Amazon and order the book. And the third way is to go through my publisher in Malvern, Pennsylvania, and that is Cynren Press, Cynren, and order it that way. And they're the 3 ways you can, or you can go to Beatlefest in Jersey City, where hopefully I will have my little table set up April 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. Thank you.
Well, before we go and ask about Paul's book, when the show's over, you're going to be a sport and help us sing Out with the End?
Oh, yes.
I'm just
Of
getting a
course.
commitment before we launch into the tune. And Paul, where can people go? Where can the listeners go when they want to order a copy of your book?
Well, the best place, obviously, my book, all my books are on Amazon. They can go to my website, which is www.paulferranteauthor.com, where they'll see all my books listed. They'll see write-ups on all of them. They'll see my blog. And, hopefully I'll be at Beatlefest signing some books. I'd love to meet different fans and interact with them. And I love to get emails. You can email me through my website. We can talk about the books. And please write reviews on Amazon, because that always helps. So, that's probably the best way to go about it. And this has just been a wonderful opportunity to get the word out there.
The Word, one of my favorite songs. But it's funny, I was thinking, when we were talking about Memphis and all the stuff that happened, I thought it was cool that at the end, John Lennon had more than half of a Christian album made with songs like Amen and Crossing the River Jordan and Help Me to Help Myself. Jude Kessler talked about that. So it's such an interesting subject. I hope she'll come back and talk about that. And we'll have you guys back as well.
Thank
so who
you.
wants to sing
Thank
the
you.
end?
We're all going to sing.
I'm going to start it with N in the end, and Pat, you have The Love You Take, and then Paul will say it's equal to, and Warren with his classic, The Love You Make. So Patty has The Love You Take, and Warren, The Love You Make. I would screw that up, but who cares? Here we go. You guys ready?
Yep.
Ready.
And in the end,
The love you take
is equal to the
Love you made.
Yes.
All right, good show, guys.
Thank you.
thanks.
I'm going to sign everybody off here, and then I will talk to you in a little bit.
and
Thank you.
Pat, send me that address because I found that for your daughter.
I will. Take care.
Send it an
Thank
email.
I
you,
know.
Paul.
Thank you.
Patty.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good show.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.